August 6, 1945, 8:15 in the morning, above the Japanese city of Hiroshima, at an altitude of 9,470 meters, a single Boeing B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay is holding steady at 330 kilometers per hour. Inside its bomb bay, a device 4 meters long and 72 centimeters wide, containing 64 kilograms of uranium-235, is armed and counting down its final 15 seconds of existence. 15 seconds before the world changed permanently. The men inside that aircraft, and the men who built what it carried, had spent 3 years arriving at this moment. Most of them did not yet understand what arriving here would cost them for the rest of their lives. Colonel Paul Warfield Tibbets Jr., 30 years old, sat at the controls of the Enola Gay. He was lean, sharp-featured, with the kind of calm that only exists in men who have already decided something completely. Tibbets had been hand-picked in September 1944 by General Leslie Richard Groves himself, not because he was the most decorated pilot in the Army Air Forces, but because he was the most precise. Groves needed a man who could fly a specific altitude, a specific heading, a specific turn sequence, and execute it identically every time, regardless of what was happening around him. Tibbets fit that description exactly. He had flown the first American bombing mission over occupied Europe. He had personally tested early prototypes of what would eventually become the bomb, now hanging in his aircraft's belly. He knew what was in the bay. He had known for months. Sitting beside him at the co-pilot position was Captain Robert Allen Lewis, 26 years old. Lewis was the regular aircraft commander of the Enola Gay before Tibbets took primary command of the mission. He was shorter than Tibbets, broader, and considerably more expressive. A man who processed things outwardly where Tibbets processed them inward. Lewis had been kept partially in the dark about the full nature of the weapon. He knew it was large. He knew it was experimental. He knew it was expected to produce an explosion, unlike anything previously documented. What he did not fully know, what none of the crew below the command level fully knew, was what the yield would actually look like from 9,000 meters up. Lewis kept a personal log during the flight. He had been writing in it since they departed Tinian Island in the Mariana Islands, 4 hours and 15 minutes earlier. In the aircraft's lower compartment, seated at the weaponeer's station, was Navy Captain William Sterling Parsons, 44 years old, calm in the particular way of men who have spent their careers adjacent to explosives. Parsons was the bomb's handler. His role was not to drop it, but to ensure it was ready to be dropped. In a decision made the night before departure, Parsons had insisted on arming the bomb in flight, rather than on the ground at Tinian. 3 B-29s loaded with experimental weapons had crashed on takeoff from that same airfield in recent weeks. Parsons had watched one of them. He told Groves plainly, if the Enola Gay crashes on takeoff with this device fully armed, the resulting explosion would take out half the island and everyone on it. Groves approved the in-flight arming. Parsons spent the night before the mission teaching himself the procedure by flashlight, kneeling on the floor of a warehouse, rehearsing the sequence with his hands until he could complete it without error in the dark, at altitude, in turbulence, wearing gloves. 4 hours into the flight, crouched in the unpressurized forward bomb bay at -14 degrees Celsius. Parsons had completed the arming sequence. The device called Little Boy was live. The bombardier was Major Thomas Wilson Ferebee, 26 years old, from Mocksville, North Carolina. Ferebee was widely regarded as the most accurate bombardier in the 20th Air Force. He had logged more than 63 combat missions over Europe and North Africa. He had a reputation that preceded him into every briefing room he entered. His hands were steady in a way that other bombardiers studied. His eye was calibrated to read wind drift, altitude variance, and forward motion simultaneously and produce a release point that consistently landed within meters of the intended target. Ferebee had been briefed on the target, the Aioi Bridge at the center of Hiroshima, and had studied reconnaissance photographs of it for weeks. He knew its exact shape from above. He knew what the surrounding city looked like in different light conditions. He had a picture of it in his mind as precise as a blueprint. The navigator was Captain Theodore Jerome Van Kirk, 24 years old, the youngest man in a primary crew role aboard the Enola Gay. Van Kirk was from Northumberland, Pennsylvania, and had already flown 58 combat missions. His navigation across the Pacific that morning had been exact. The aircraft had arrived at the initial point, the final navigation checkpoint before the bomb run, on schedule, on course, and at the correct altitude. Van Kirk had done his job so cleanly that Tibbets had little to correct and nothing to recalculate. Van Kirk sat at his station tracking position and noting the time, and on the ground below, at the exact moment the Enola Gay was crossing its initial point and Ferebee was locking the Norden bombsight onto the Aioi Bridge, a Japanese radar operator named Sergeant Hideo Amemiya was sitting at a tracking station at Matsuyama Airfield, 17 kilometers east of the city. Amemiya, 22 years old, was one of the few men in the Hiroshima defense network still actively tracking inbound aircraft that morning. The air raid alarm had been sounded at 7:09 in the morning when American weather aircraft, B-29s, flying ahead of the Enola Gay to assess cloud cover, had been detected approaching the city. The all-clear had been issued at 7:31 when those aircraft did not attack. Most of the population had returned to their morning routines. Some had gone back to sleep. Amemiya had not. He was still watching his screen. At 8:09, he detected 3 aircraft at high altitude approaching from the south. He logged the contact. He reached for his telephone to report it. The call had not yet connected when the flash came. Go back to the spring of 1942. The United States is 4 months into a war it did not begin and was not prepared for. The Pacific Fleet is shattered at Pearl Harbor. American forces in the Philippines have surrendered or are surrounded. Japan controls a territory that stretches from the Aleutian Islands to the edge of India. And inside a small office in Washington, General Leslie Richard Groves is being handed a project. Groves was 50 years old, a West Point engineer, compact and blunt, with a mind that treated obstacles as scheduling problems and treated people as variables to be placed in correct positions. He had just completed the construction of the Pentagon, the largest office building in the world, in 16 months, under budget, and while managing a workforce of 13,000. He was given the Manhattan Project in September 1942 and told to produce an atomic bomb before Germany did. He accepted the assignment in the manner of a man given a large logistics problem, which is exactly how he treated it for the next 3 years. Groves understood immediately that the project had 2 separate problems. The first was physics. He solved that by hiring the best physicist in the country, Julius Robert Oppenheimer, and giving him an unlimited budget, a secret city in the New Mexico desert, and a directive that could be summarized in 3 words: make it work. The second problem was delivery. A bomb that could not be reliably delivered to a target was an expensive laboratory result. Groves needed a pilot, a platform, and a process he could trust without variation. The platform was the B-29 Superfortress. By 1944, it was the heaviest production bomber in existence. Wingspan of 43 meters, 4 Wright R-3350 engines, a pressurized crew cabin, and a combat range of over 5,000 kilometers. It could fly higher and farther than any fighter could follow. It had been designed specifically for the Pacific, for distances that European theater aircraft had never needed to cover. Its bomb bay was large enough to carry the device that Oppenheimer's team was building, but only barely. The B-29 was modified heavily for the mission. The standard gun turrets were stripped out to reduce weight. The bomb bay doors were redesigned. The fuel systems were upgraded. The modifications were classified and performed by a unit that did not officially exist, the 509th Composite Group, activated in December 1944 under Tibbets' command and based at Wendover Army Airfield in the Utah desert, a location chosen for its isolation. The unit trained in total secrecy for 8 months. Crew members were not told what they were training to deliver. Tibbets knew, Parsons knew, Ferebee knew the target parameters. The others flew practice missions dropping single oversized bomb shapes, called pumpkins, from precise altitudes, practicing the identical breakaway maneuver that Tibbets had calculated was necessary to outrun the blast. That maneuver was itself a problem. The bomb was expected to detonate at 575 meters above the ground, 43 seconds after release. The Enola Gay, traveling at its current speed, would cover less than 4 kilometers in that 43 seconds. The blast radius of a successful detonation, based on Trinity test data from Alamogordo, New Mexico, in July 1945, was sufficient to destroy an aircraft at that range. Tibbets had calculated that the escape required a 155-degree diving turn immediately after release, hard bank, nose down, building speed through the turn, to reach a minimum safe distance before detonation. The maneuver had to be executed flawlessly. There was no second attempt available. By July 1945, the 509th had relocated to North Field on Tinian Island, a flat coral plateau 4 kilometers wide and 8 kilometers long that had been captured from Japan the previous year. North Field had become the largest operational airfield in the world by area, with 4 parallel runways, each over 2.5 kilometers long. The 509th occupied a restricted section of the base. Their aircraft were kept in guarded revetments. Their operations building had armed sentries at the door around the clock. On July 26th, the components of Little Boy arrived at Tinian aboard the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis. The uranium core, in specially designed containers, was carried separately from the assembly components. The Indianapolis had crossed the Pacific in 10 days at high speed without escort, its cargo so secret that even its own orders were compartmentalized. 3 days after delivering its cargo, the Indianapolis was sunk by a Japanese submarine in the Philippine Sea. 879 men died, most of them over 4 days in shark-infested water, because no one immediately realized the ship was missing. The connection between the Indianapolis and its cargo was not publicly discussed for decades. The assembly of Little Boy at Tinian took 4 days. Parsons oversaw it personally. The device was a gun-type fission weapon, meaning a conventional explosive would fire one mass of uranium down a barrel into a second mass of uranium, triggering a supercritical chain reaction. It was simpler in design than the plutonium bomb simultaneously being prepared for a second mission. But simpler did not mean safe. The uranium components were kept separated until the final arming sequence for exactly this reason. By the night of August 5th, the weapon was loaded into the Enola Gay's bomb bay. Ground crews worked under floodlights. Photographers from the Manhattan Project documentation team recorded the loading sequence. Tibbets briefed his crew at midnight. He told them, for the first time, exactly what they were carrying. The crew had 1 hour to process that information. Then they were given their flight briefing, their meteorological report. Clouds over Hiroshima were forecast at less than 30% coverage, and their mission order. Tibbets had named the aircraft after his mother, Enola Gay Tibbets, who had named him Paul after a missionary preacher and raised him in Quincy, Illinois. He had ordered the name painted on the nose of the aircraft the previous day without advance notice to anyone on the base. His crew had seen it for the first time that afternoon. Takeoff was at 2:45 in the morning on August 6th. The aircraft was so heavily loaded that it used virtually the entire length of runway Able before lifting. Van Kirk began his navigation from the moment the wheels left the ground. The flight north and west to Japan took just over 6 hours. At 7:25, the Enola Gay crossed the Japanese coastline and began its final approach to the target area. Tibbets confirmed cloud cover with the weather aircraft. Hiroshima was clear. The backup targets were Kokura and Nagasaki. Hiroshima remained primary. The decision was confirmed and not revisited. At 8:09, Tibbets announced over the intercom that they were beginning the bomb run. Ferebee took control of the aircraft through the Norden bombsight. Standard procedure for the final targeting approach. Tibbets maintained altitude and heading according to Ferebee's input. The crew put on their polarized goggles. The goggles were designed to protect against flash blindness, even at 9,000 meters of altitude. The light output of a successful detonation was expected to exceed safe limits for unprotected eyes. Van Kirk noted the time and position. Parsons sat at his station and watched his instruments. Lewis continued writing in his flight log. Below them, the city of Hiroshima was beginning its working day. 340,000 people, military and civilian, in a city that had been almost entirely untouched by the American bombing campaign that had already reduced Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya to ash. Hiroshima's relative preservation had not been accidental. Groves had placed it on a restricted list months earlier specifically to preserve it as a target whose destruction could be accurately measured. At 8:14 and 17 seconds, Ferebee identified the Aioi Bridge in his bombsight, the distinctive T-shaped junction at the center of the city, and locked the release. The Norden system calculated forward throw, wind drift, and terminal velocity automatically. At 8:15 and 17 seconds, the bomb bay doors opened. 61 seconds later, not 43, because Little Boy required additional time in free fall to reach arming condition. The weapon detonated at 576 meters above the Shima Surgical Clinic, 250 meters southeast of the intended target point. Before we continue, if you're finding this story worth your time, please subscribe. It helps us keep making content at this level. Now let's see what those final 15 seconds produced. In those 15 seconds between release and detonation, the Enola Gay had already begun Tibbets' calculated turn. The bank was hard and immediate. 155 degrees, nose dropping, engines pushing the aircraft through the maneuver as fast as physics allowed. Van Kirk was gripping his navigation table. Lewis had stopped writing. Parsons was watching his instruments. Ferebee had released the bombsight controls and was bracing. Tibbets later said the turn felt like the aircraft was resisting him, that the weight of the previous hours was physically in the controls. He said nothing to the crew over the intercom during the maneuver. The device fell for 61 seconds. It covered 9,500 meters of altitude in that time, at 576 meters above the clinic, a building full of patients and medical staff who had just returned inside after the earlier all clear. The uranium masses achieved supercriticality. The yield was equivalent to 15,000 tons of conventional explosive, released in less than 1 microsecond. The fireball reached a diameter of 280 meters in the first second. Surface temperatures at the hypocenter reached 4,000 degrees Celsius. The pressure wave moved outward at the speed of sound and beyond, destroying every reinforced concrete structure within 500 meters, every wooden structure within 2 kilometers, and every human being without shelter within approximately 1 kilometer of the hypocenter. Aboard the Enola Gay, the shock wave caught them before they had completed the turn. The aircraft lurched. Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant George Richard Caron, the only crew member with an unobstructed rear view, saw the fireball expanding below and behind them and described it as a purple boiling mass that rose faster than the aircraft was climbing away from it. He was not exaggerating. The mushroom cloud was eventually measured at 13 kilometers in height. Tibbets leveled the aircraft and brought it back to altitude. He flew 1 orbit around the target area. Below them, where a city had existed 45 minutes earlier, there was a flat gray circle of destruction approximately 5 kilometers in diameter, from which a single pillar of smoke and debris was rising into the stratosphere. Lewis wrote 4 words in his flight log at 8:16. They have been quoted in every subsequent account of the mission. The words were, "My God, what have we done?" They were the last words he wrote on that flight. Sergeant Hideo Amemiya, the radar operator at Matsuyama Airfield, survived. He was 17 kilometers from the hypocenter. The flash reached him before any sound. He described, in a written account filed 40 years later with the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, the sensation of white. Not an explosion, not a blast, but simply white, arriving before any other sensation. He was knocked from his chair by the pressure wave that arrived approximately 57 seconds after the flash. He spent 3 days treating himself and the men around him before organized medical response reached his station. He filed his contact report, the one he had been writing when the flash came, the following week, from a hospital bed. It was the only complete Japanese radar record of the Enola Gay's approach over Hiroshima. In the weeks that followed, Tibbets received the Distinguished Service Cross from General Carl Spaatz on the runway at Tinian within hours of landing. The ceremony lasted less than 4 minutes. The crew was debriefed, medically examined, and isolated from general base population for 72 hours. Thomas Ferebee never spoke extensively about the mission publicly during his active service years. He returned to civilian life after the war, worked in business, and declined most media requests for decades. He said in a 1994 interview, the only one he gave with any depth, that he thought about the bomb every day, not with guilt, he said, just as a fact. Theodore Van Kirk became an educator. He spent years speaking in schools about the war, the mission, and what he believed it meant. He was the last surviving member of the primary Enola Gay crew. He died in July 2014 at 93 years old, at his home in Stone Mountain, Georgia. William Parsons was promoted to Rear Admiral within a year of the mission. He became a senior technical advisor to the Atomic Energy Commission and worked on nuclear weapons policy until his death from a heart attack in December 1953. He was 52 years old. His role in the in-flight arming decision, the one that may have prevented the accidental destruction of Tinian Island, was not included in the first round of public histories about the mission. It appeared in declassified documents 30 years later. Robert Lewis flew his final combat mission 3 weeks after Hiroshima. He returned to the United States, struggled with the civilian transition that many returning pilots experienced, and worked in a series of jobs over the following decades. His flight log, the one containing the 4 words written at 8:16, was sold at auction in 1971 for $37,000. Lewis used the money to pay debts. He died in 1983. Paul Tibbets continued flying. He was assigned to nuclear weapons testing operations at Bikini Atoll in 1946. He flew the first jet aircraft across the North Atlantic. He eventually reached the rank of Brigadier General before retiring in 1966. He spent the following decades defending the mission without apology and without self-pity, neither seeking absolution nor performing regret. He gave interviews that made many people uncomfortable with his plainness. He was asked repeatedly, across decades, whether he ever lost sleep over Hiroshima. His answer did not change. He said he slept well. He said the mission ended a war. He said he would do it again under the same circumstances. He died in November 2007 at 82 years old. In his will, he left instructions that there be no funeral, no grave marker, and no ceremony. He had watched too many people turn his name into a symbol, some making him a hero, others making him a monster, and he wanted to deny them the continued use of his physical location for that argument. There is no grave.